If Spielberg's Shark had worked, I don't think it would have been anywhere near as good of a movie. That essentially his mechanical shark didn't work very well. And so he was like, well, I guess we'll just try to do it with suspense. You won't see the shark. You only see the effect of the shark. And you're like, that's so much better.
Let's jump into Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Well, we start with Jonathan Harker's journal. He's a young solicitor, which is something like kind of like a lawyer / accountant, as I understand it. And he's been sent to Transylvania on his employer's behalf. I can't quite remember the old man who he works for.
Hawkins.
Hawkins.
There is a preponderance of R sounds. There's Jonathan Harker. There is Mr. Hawkins. There's a moving company that becomes significant at some point. That is the Harris Moving Company.
Yep.
Bram Stoker. I don't know. Maybe his name dictionary. Maybe somebody went and tore out all of the entries except for H.
Could be. Hawkins is also a Dickensian name, and I bet Bram Stoker's a fan of Dickens too.
Also, the name of the town in Stranger Things, which I was like, I think that might be something.
Yeah, I bet it is.
And the Russian ship is called the Demeter, which is the name of the ship that gets stranded in Scavenger's Reign, and that is 100% an allusion to Dracula.
I'm sure. But so anyway, we have he's a young man. He's been sent to Transylvania, and at first he's kind of excited, maybe a little bit nervous. But as he's nearing his client, who is an ancient Carpathian mountain count, or from an ancient family, we don't know that he's ancient. Harker's staying at various inns in the area in Transylvania, and he starts encountering these clues that something is wrong. Just bad omens. But eventually, after kind of an eerie coach ride, he arrives at Castle Dracula, and the old count welcomes him warmly and is quite friendly, and cooks him or prepares a delicious meal, and at first is quite affable and charming. And so Harker's put at ease, but then after a day or two starts noticing odd things about his host, Count Dracula. Doesn't seem to eat, doesn't appear during the day, and then things get even more and more disturbing. We see he has visions or dreams of vampire women. There's the strong implication that a child has been murdered and perhaps feasted on by Dracula and these women. And Harker decides he needs to escape. And I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, there's a bunch of the Count doesn't show up in mirrors, and then smashes Harker's shaving mirror. Harker cuts himself during that scene, and the Count is almost sort of driven into like a blood frenzy, as it seems. Harker watches him climb like head first down a like vertiginous cliff.
Right.
Things are weird. And then Harker follows suit. He actually also scales the wall, goes to the Count's chambers and finds him asleep in a coffin, and sort of resolves to try to kill him with a shovel, but at the last second is kind of deterred. And then Harker kind of begins to realize that he is in fact a prisoner. And that section of the novel ends sort of obliquely with us not being totally sure about what has happened to Jonathan Harker. And we're transported back to England and kind of tossed into what at first feels like a Jane Austen
novel,
comedy of manners,
right?
About there's this like very attractive young woman named Lucy Westenra who has 3 proposals in one day, and she's sort of decided on one of them. And there's some scenes with the other 2 suitors. There's a strong relationship between Lucy and Mina Murray, who is Jonathan Harker's fiance. So we sort of get this like inverted pattern as Lucy's fortunes romantically are rising and Mina's are falling because she can't, she doesn't hear from Jonathan for months, and she's starting to get more and more worried. We have the three suitors, Arthur Holmwood, who is Lucy's fiance, and then Dr. John Seward, who also proposed to Lucy. He is a superintendent of an insane asylum. And then Quincy Morris, a sort of minor character who is a Texan, whose dialogue is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
But another frustrated suitor of Lucy's. They live in a town called Whitby. And one of the first things that we discover, there's a storm and a mysterious Russian ship appears sort of at full sail, which would be a terrible idea in a storm. And it actually sails directly into the harbor and runs itself aground. The entire crew is dead or absent. And we discover the captain has sort of lashed himself to the steering wheel, and a giant dog jumps off of the boat and disappears into the countryside, and never to be seen again, except that some other animals are quickly found dead, slashed open, their necks cut, that sort of thing, within the next few days and weeks. And I will kick it back over to you.
Yeah, it's not clear to me if Mina lives in Whitby or is just on like a long holiday there. Because she also seems to have homes in London, as does Lucy. But they're both in Whitby for a while, though one point one's in London and one's in Whitby, and they're writing each other. So while all this happens, John Seward, the superintendent of the insane asylum, is he's a minor character in Mina and Lucy's correspondence, but we're also reading his journal, and he's encountered a very odd patient, Renfield, who he calls a zoophage, who wishes to eat living things, including at one point flies, and then spiders, and then birds. And he also suggests that he has a master who is coming to London. We also get to read the ship's log from the Russian vessel, the Demeter, and it appears that somebody has I forget the term when somebody sneaks onto a ship. There's a stowaway who appears to be murdering the entire crew, and the captain catches sight of him but refuses to abandon ship and instead lashes himself with a cross to the steerage. Lucy starts sleepwalking, and Mina notices 2 puncture wounds on her neck, and also one point follows her sleepwalking and seems to spy a dark figure hovering over her when she's sitting on a bench somewhere. There's a lot of things that are happening at once. We learn that Jonathan is safe and has turned up in a convent or a hospital in Budapest, and there's like a nice nun who's been taking care of him, and he doesn't remember. He's been kind of raving about terrible things. Meanwhile, Lucy is starting to fall into poor health, and she's showing signs of blood loss. And so Seward is alarmed enough that he calls for his Dutch friend and mentor, Dr. Abraham van Helsing, who comes from the Netherlands to help out. And Abraham Velsing is very charming. He speaks in a very amusing version of English.
Totally.
And he has a theory about what's causing the illness, but he won't say it. And this is sort of actually mirrored by the nun or nurse in Budapest not recounting Jonathan's ravings, when he's dreaming. There's a lot of and even Jonathan in his journal says something like, I suspect, I dare not write what I suspect. There's a lot of people suspect something awful. People
suspect the plot getting out.
Right. And so Van Helsing suspects that there's maybe something supernatural at work. There are hints that a bat is trying to get into her room, and in fact a wolf shows up who has escaped from the zoo and shatters the window, and then we don't quite know what happens after that. Van Helsing has tried to use garlic flowers to protect Lucy, but his efforts don't work, and Lucy becomes increasingly ill after all 4 men, like the 3 suitors and Van Helsing, all donate blood to try to save her, and she sadly dies.
Van Helsing says this is just the beginning, because very towards the end, Lucy is acting very oddly, and Arthur tries to kiss her, and Van Helsing sort of prevents it because it seems that she might be making a lunge for his neck of some sort. And then children in the neighborhood start seeing an odd lady, and a child goes missing and returns with bite marks. And I'm sure we will discover everything that occurs in the second half of this book. But yeah, as you've already kind of pointed out, there's a lot of holding back of facts in order for the mystery of the novel to not be revealed. I think one of the most, I mean, obviously, I don't know when blood typing became like a thing, but thank God Lucy is AB positive, because this novel would have stopped like much sooner.
Actually, my trivia is about this very topic. But yes, you're right. Blood type. I'll tell you without giving too much away that blood typing was discovered in the around 1904 or 1905. So just a few.
Okay, well.
So just a few years later, and in the 1880s and 1890s, blood transfusions were common, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't, and people did not know why.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
Jesus. Oh, that's awful.
Yeah. I mean, they were generally tried in desperate circumstances when it's sort of like, well, it's either that or they're going to die. And sometimes they would work and sometimes they wouldn't. And when they worked, the doctors were like, well, we must thank God, for his will has reigned. And when they didn't work, they didn't know. But actually, I have more information about that in my trivia question for you later in the show.
I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be awesome. Unsurprisingly, my trivia is about letters, given the nature of this book, which is funny. I mean, it's sort of a half epistolary novel because we do get some letters, but mostly what we get are diary entries.
Sure.
And I don't know, I was sort of
they're all documents. Everything we're reading has been written by somebody, either as a diary. In some cases, it's newspaper correspondence or newspaper articles or telegrams but everything. It's as though the whole novel is a scrapbook that's been assembled from letters and documents and other things.
Yeah, it's this wild collaging. Did you read the very short foreword?
No.
that fits.
Or just sort of something like the reader will determine the circumstances that all of these writings have come together, or something to that effect.
Yeah, totally. It's the closest thing that we get to a frame.
Yeah.
And a little bit of, and therefore, sort of reminds us of all the other great framed narratives that are out there. But yeah, there is sort of a funny tongue-in-cheek nature to the foreword. How these papers have been placed in sequence will be made clear in the reading of them. Of course they will. All needless matters have been eliminated, so that a history almost at variance with the possibilities of latter-day belief may stand forth as simple fact. There is throughout no statement of past events wherein memory may err, for all the records chosen are exactly contemporary, given from the standpoints and within the range of knowledge of those who made them. It's sort of this wild assertion of authorial fiat. And it's just sort of a nice little piece of authorial sleight of hand, I thought. It is a collection of documents.
I think that's very common in the 19th century. I think part of it is that the third person close perspective. I don't know when that was invented, but I don't think it was widespread in the 1880s and 1890s. So, even great novels. Although now I think about it, didn't Dickens write in third person close? So I could be wrong about that. But, if you think about, Mark Twain usually wrote, Huck Finn is written in Huck Finn's voice. I don't know. I could be wrong about this, but it does seem to me that it's far more common, and it also sort of like Victorian horror. It's just far more common for there to be a first-person novel, or to be even this sort of notion of some device of where you have people sort of, I hear the sounds of the cart drawing, I must conclude this letter, and then it goes on another 3 pages, and you're like, you must have made the cartman wait like a half hour, or people could write. It just seems to me that I don't know exactly, but it seems to me that the third-person close perspective was less well known in those days, and so that this is a method for telling a narrative where you get multiple characters' perspectives. But I think the other thing about it is that none of these characters really know what's going on, and the reader has the privilege of connecting all of these events in a way that I think it's brilliant. I mean, I think, it's not that hard to understand what's actually happening. And maybe that could be the benefit of being a 21st century reader and sort of knowing the Dracula story as almost like a canonical one. Even though I'd never seen a Dracula movie, I've pretty much only encountered Dracula through satire, like Transylvania 65000, or like Count Von Count, or watching Ed Wood about Bela Lugosi. Like I've never watched a Dracula movie. I actually really want to now. But the entire time I feel like I know what's going on. And actually that gets to my next question, which is, what is the first piece of violence that you can remember that we actually witness, like as opposed to happening off stage or implied violence?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's the attempted murder with the shovel in the crypt, but it's not really a piece of violence because he isn't able to carry through with it. And I think that's the important part, is that there's like the nature of vampires is that they are charming and terrifying. Right. And that's kind of what puts Harker off. Even though we also know that, he probably wouldn't have been able to kill Dracula with a shovel. That's the first one that jumps to mind, even though that's kind of a half answer. And I'm trying to think of where we might see it next.
I think there's only one or two. There's the only other thing like that is Renfield stabbing Seward in the arm with a dinner knife.
And then this hilarious like fight between Renfield and some like day laborers.
Who have to get bought off by Renfield's assistant. And they're quite put out by it until their bride or they get a few drinks. But my point here is, that's all there's a tremendous amount of violence in this story. It's all pretty much all off scene, right? There's a moment where the three vampire women, Dracula's brides, we don't know if they're real or not, but they appear to Harker in a dream. And there's a moment where Dracula shows up and says, you can't eat you may not have this young man. He's mine. And they say something like, will we have nothing? And then the implication is that Dracula has a child in a sack, and then we don't know what happens, but the mother of that child shows up. I guess I think we see the mother attacked by wolves, right? That we do actually see that. So that's another example of violence, but we're led to believe that Dracula and his brides have murdered and consumed this child quite horribly. We're also led to believe that Dracula has been getting into Lucy's room and sucking her blood at night. And then we're led to believe that Lucy has been revived, as an undead creature and has been sucking the blood of these children at night. None of that is spoken. We don't see it. Right. Nor does anyone ever tell us that. It's all clues, and I just think that's brilliant, and I think I don't know. I mean, it's not what I expected, and I thought this novel was going to be a lot more violent and terrifying in that way, and all the horror comes from implication and the reader's capacity to put these various clues and signs and this mood together and create their own narrative from that, which I just think is brilliant.
Well, think about the horror movies that you have seen. Like, what are some things? This basically goes into my next question, which I'm stoked that like yours is leading into this one, because you're right. There isn't much violence, and I hadn't noticed that. But what are the things that are going on for the protagonists in horror? Like, what kind of unites them? And you're already talking about several of them.
Well, I think that there's lots of horror, different kinds of horror, and I don't like most of it. I don't really like body horror. I've forced myself to watch Friday the 13th and A Nightmare of Elm Street, and those are very unpleasant experiences for me. And I've never seen Saw, and I've never seen Halloween. But I've watched enough of those slasher movies to know that the protagonist and it keeps finding the evidence of, there's a murderer stalking us, and the protagonist is encountering more and more evidence about what is happening and why, and finally learns enough about the mysterious killer in order to temporarily defeat the monster. Almost always, it's almost always a female protagonist and almost always a male killer, which Dracula has in common. My favorite horror movies are the supernatural is often replaced by the uncanny. And the protagonist knows very little, but what the way in which it's horrific is the mood and the sense that violence could occur at any moment. And to me, the greatest example in the modern era of that is The Shining, of which there is only one act of violence in the entire movie.
Right.
Now, there's attempted violence, but there's only one murder in the entire movie. It feels like a horrifically violent and terrifying movie to me. But I think that similar to Dracula, The Shining is playing on the uncanny and the sense of suggestion. And the way in which both in this case, the watcher, in our case, the reader, is piecing together what is happening and becoming increasingly concerned for the sympathetic protagonist. I think another great example of this in recent years is Get Out. Where you don't really figure out what's happening until like the final act, the final third of the movie. And at that point, it sort of becomes a kind of entertaining adventure movie. The horror of Get Out is the sense that something is wrong, but we don't really know what it is. And also maybe it's not wrong. Like the protagonist in Get Out is very much in the position of Harker in Dracula's castle, which is he can't let on that he thinks something is amiss because, at least for the time being, everybody's pretending that nothing is amiss. And kind of like the same thing with Jack in, the Colorado Hotel or whatever, the hotel that he's in The Shining, yet nobody can really... there's something about the situation that keeps anybody from acknowledging that it's actually horrific, too.
Yeah. So, I think you're nailing like all of it. And then the final little piece that I, would ask is like thinking about all those movies that you just talked about. So, and books. So Dracula, The Shining, Get Out, even the slasher films. What would you say about the agency of the protagonists in like the first half or the first 2/3 of
I would say the protagonists have almost no agency in and then often in the final act the protagonists claw back some enough agency at least to... I mean, Jaws is another great example too.
Yes.
And I think Jaws is also an example of one that succeeds in spite of its technical... Like if Spielberg's Shark had worked, I don't think it would have been anywhere near as good of a movie. Essentially his mechanical shark didn't work very well. And so he was like, well, I guess we'll just try to do it with suspense. You won't see the shark. You only see the effect of the shark. And you're like, that's so much better. And then when you do finally see, the 30-foot Jaws emerge, that's fine because the buildup has been so great. But like if you were to see that model the entire time, I think it would get boring pretty quickly, as proved by hundreds of other shark horror movies, none of which are anywhere near as good as Jaws, in my opinion. But I think you're right that the characters have very limited agency, and it's so frustrating. We know that Dracula is somehow getting into Lucy's room and sucking her blood every night. And even Van Helsing knows it. And he's represented as being kind of like a match for Dracula, And yet he's powerless to stop it. And sometimes it's a little bit comical where he's like, I'm going to put the flowers around her. And then the mother's like, she's feeling better because I took those god awful flowers away. And Van Helsing.
Such a stink in there.
Yeah. This book has a real flair for humor too.
It does. It's wonderfully like when I say modern, I don't mean contemporary. I mean like 30 years later. It's kind of like it winks at you in places.
Oh, quite often, yeah. And you know, we can keep talking about horror, but I actually think your question. Let me know, because I want to build on your question to ask my question about theme, because I think it totally builds on the point you just made.
Well, you know, what I was sort of getting at with the form and function and the nature of horror. So, and like, you're completely nailing it about the fact that like information is scarce, like in horror.
Yep.
And the best horror movies, like Jaws, like The Shining, like they dole out so little. And to me, as I was reading this, I was like, oh my gosh, this structure of these journal entries and these letters are amazing, because like ostensibly we are reading a stack of papers. And, you know, the thing about letters and papers is that they can only record what has happened. There's no casting forward into the future.
Right.
So we are left with just this, like, the trailing average of what happened.
Yeah.
And that like fits so perfectly into horror, because we as readers, there's a little of that dramatic irony, and especially like, you know, we've ingested, I mean, you and I have ingested 4.5 decades of vampires, but there's the rest of the world has gotten, you know, hundreds of years of vampires. So we sort of know that those bits and pieces.
Yeah.
And that, like, the mechanism of dread in this book is just so finely tuned, and I'm really impressed by that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because I feel like I always know what's happening, and I'm never shown too much, and nor, you know, I think that body horror. I mean, you know, some people can make a case for it, and that's fine. But I think that it's leaning on the lurid, and this book does not lean on the lurid really. At a couple moments it does, but mostly it leans on the sense of the uncanny. And what it also does is create some really compelling characters who you want to see survive this. Like Mina is wonderful, you know, and I mean, she's probably my favorite character, as well as Van Helsing. But then the three lads are quite compelling. Renfield is fascinating, you know, all of that, and their interactions with each other feels very real. You know, it has that Jane Austen quality of where you sort of feel drawn into their social world, and you're like, oh, you know, poor Quincy in his suit, but he seems like that moment where I think it's Quincy invites Arthur and Jonathan to kind of like toast Arthur's good fortune. Yeah, it's one. I think I teared up. You know, like it's just friendship embodied. And I think part of the reason the horror works so well is that the book does such a great job dramatizing friendship as well. Yeah. Which brings me to my very challenging question, and I'm going to ask myself the same question, but of course I've had the chance to think about it. You only get one word. What's this book about? You can explain yourself after you say that word, but you have to boil it down to one word.
Anxiety.
Okay. Explain yourself, and I'll give you mine.
Okay. So, like, generally, like, the way that I've encountered horror and body horror and things like, and zombie films and you know, works like that are generally about some sort of larger societal anxiety. Like, what is going on with... And late 19th century England is like rapidly industrializing. Like their immigration is high, sickness is high, urbanization is happening, and that's like, you know, people are in close quarters, but medicine is not really caught up yet, and so there's like lots and lots of social anxiety, and vampires have always kind of stood in for the things that are at our borders that are going to take things away from us. Or in the case of like sickness, the things that are already here that are going to kill us and take things away from us.
That we're powerless to resist.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, like, vampires start showing up in the 11th century in like some Russian literature, but the idea has been around forever. I mean,
I think in anthropology, like most cultures have some version of a blood sucking or life sucking essence creature. Something that sucks your life or sucks your blood.
I think that the theme here is about anxiety. So, and that's my justification for it.
Well, I don't disagree. If I had to boil it down to one word, it would be rape.
And tell me about that.
I thought, I think you could also say sex. I certainly don't disagree with anxiety. And, so we have a man who takes what he wants, but he seems mostly drawn to women and beautiful young women. And the three women who he has kind of enslaved and he has in his thrall, his brides in the castle, their desire for Jonathan's blood is represented as much as a lust as a hunger. And and even when there's this moment where one of them is about to bite into Jonathan's neck and Dracula stops her. And in that moment, Harker admits to himself that he has a kind of pleasurable anticipation. And so I think the act of vampiric violence is very much a stand-in for sex. And it's not even hidden. When Lucy becomes sort of vampiric, at various times in her illnesses, she seems more vampiric than other times. And at her most vampiric, she's seductive. And she's asking for a kiss. The vampire women call biting Jonathan's neck a kiss. And Dracula is this powerful man who uses his wealth to go wherever he wants in the globe. And if he sees a young woman he wants, he enters her bedroom and takes what he wants from her. And I think, this is a time, Victorian England, where it's really, really hard to talk about sex. They don't really talk about sex. It's all very oblique. And so, I mean, and that's not to say it's not about anxieties around, immigration and globalization and industrialization too. But to me, the central, it's a story about a rapist.
Well, yeah. I mean, it can also be, it can be an anxiety about intimacy.
Right.
Like in some ways, like Dracula could be like the original incel.
Yeah. Well, he is kind of like a Silicon Valley billionaire incel. Like he's powerful. He's kind of unstoppable, and he wants to live forever, and he's willing to destroy anybody that stands in the way of living forever. And he's not held accountable sexually. I mean, it to me, he feels like a very contemporary sort of character, and I think the horror of Dracula coming into Lucy's bedroom, and it's so interesting. It's so Victorian that it never occurs to the men that they could just sit up in her bedroom and guard her at night, because like then they would see her in her dressing clothes and that would be inappropriate, I guess. It's like, why doesn't Van Helsing just like guard the window, And he never, and we gather part of it is that Van Helsing's a busy man and he has other patients, but they never set any of the men to guard the window. They're always just like, well, we'll put some flowers there. I'm sure it'll be fine. Yeah. And then Dracula
they do it one night and it works. Yeah. And they never do it again.
And they never do it again. Yeah. It's very bizarre, but I think that has to do with, that the Victorian, there's this moment where I think, is it Jonathan Seward admits, he says he can't really examine Lucy because she's his friend's fiance.
Yeah.
Like,
right. There's this thing about like, again, intimacy, right. Like that it's not right for him to do that to his friend's fiance and a woman that he desired.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I mean, it's a really interesting moment too, where Jonathan Harker in his journal refers to Dracula's brides as as women, and then he says, no, they're not women. Mina is a woman. They're something else. And Mina is his fiance, and once they get married, one presumes they're going to have sex and have children, but only in that context, right? So that and it's understood they have sexual desire. Mina has this moment where she admits to being relieved that Jonathan, I think that the Hungarian nurse tells her, don't worry, it's not another woman, and Mina has to confess to some relief. Like there is a sexual attraction between them, but it's something they can't even really speak of, and it's only acceptable in the form of marriage. And so there is this. The creatures that are overt about their sexual desire are the vampires, and they frame it in sexual terms. Like the lady vampires actually say, there's enough of the young man for all of us to have a kiss. I think they say at one point.
Yeah,
by which they mean, maybe literally kiss, but also drink his blood.
Yeah. And I mean, these are the big themes of like the gothic horror time period of like secrecy, and like keeping women's sexual parts secret, but then also the violation of that. And like you see that in like all of these gothic horror novels, like the woman is like usually shut up somewhere. And there's a lot of like metaphorical stabbing, and things like that. And I think you're right that it is about, I think we can both be right. Like it is about the anxieties in this particular case of like sexual, like mores.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to move on to your Chris Craft Corner?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm so digging about this book is, I think the writing is great. There are moments when it is slightly overwrought, but again, like this is it's a page-turning gothic horror novel. It's gonna be a little overwrought. It's gonna be big.
But this my least favorite moments are sort of when people are sort of like, "Oh, it was so horrific that I could hardly bear to stand it. I'm so overwhelmed by the horrific horror of the horrorness of the horrificness that I'm encountering." But like Poe lays that on even thicker. They actually feel like Bram Stoker's a little more tasteful. Mostly he shows and doesn't tell, but there's just like a little bit of those characters, just like the moment when Harker can't bring the shovel down, I feel like that's a moment where he's leaning heavily on that sort of character describing the horror.
Yeah. And so this is right before the storm in Whitby and before the Russian the stricken Russian ship shows up.
Yeah.
And there were chunks in here where I was like, I feel like I'm reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles, or like
I love the old man. What is his name? Swale.
Oh my God. Yeah. He was wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to bother you, lady, but I was just having a joke the other day. I'm actually quite afraid of death. I'm not afraid to die, but I just don't want it to come along anytime
I actually
soon.
have that passage marked. That was one of my... the moment when he apologizes for making fun of death was one of my favorite bits of writing in the entire book.
I'm right there with you.
Because I think it's on theme. I think part of what this book is about the fear of death as well, and what one does with that. And Dracula is somebody who chooses, who seeks to, he does not accept death. He makes death. He becomes the master of death, and the old man is a foil. He's accepting.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, one of our greatest anxieties as humans is death, but then also what would it mean to step outside of death?
Yeah.
And all of the representations of undeath in our society and literature and representation at large is pretty much negative.
Yeah.
Like you don't really bump into many positive versions of undeath.
Yeah, I think maybe like Anne Rice and Twilight play around a little bit with the sort of the seduction of undeath, the appeal of it. But I haven't read either of them.
it's still always worrisome.
Yeah.
You know, like there's because to us it's unnatural, and I think that's another one of the anxieties here, and it fits really neatly. Like rape is unnatural,
Right.
like that's like as yeah, it's as unnatural a connection or intimacy as you can have, and I don't know. So I just think this book is intricately crafted.
Yeah.
And I thought that this passage is just a really nice moment. We've done tone, and I wanted to do atmosphere. And so listen to this passage and think about the words that get deployed, and then tell me when we finish, like, what is your sense of the kind of emotional timbre of this world? Lucy is more excitable than ever, but is otherwise well. Last night was very threatening, and the fishermen say that we are in for a storm. I must try to watch it and learn the weather signs. Today is a gray day, and the sun, as I write, is hidden in thick clouds, high over Kettleness. Everything is gray, except the green grass, which seems like emerald amongst it. Gray earthy rock, gray clouds, tinged with sunburst at the far edge, hang over the gray sea, into which the sandpoints stretch like gray fingers. The sea is tumbling in over the shallows and the sandy flats with a roar, muffled in the sea mists drifting inland. The horizon is lost in a gray mist. All is vastness. The clouds are piled up like giant rocks, and there is a brool over the sea that sounds like some presage of doom. Dark figures are on the beach here and there, sometimes half shrouded in the mist, and seem men like trees walking. The fishing boats are racing for home and rise and dip in the groundswell as they sweep into the harbor, bending to the scuppers. Here comes old Mr. Swales. He is making straight for me, and I can see, by the way he lifts his hat, that he wants to talk.
It's interesting because there's a beauty to it,
God,
with the emerald green, but then there's, I think, a strong sense of the unknown and the foreboding. You know, the fishing boats are racing for home. They're figures in the fog. And I think there's maybe an allusion to Hamlet, with men like trees, like that feels sort of Macbethy, that there's something out there that might be a threat. I don't know what the brool means, but I imagine that to be kind of like the low rumble of distant thunder. And the sense that everything is sort of peaceful for the moment, but it's that something wicked that way comes. But then of course Mr. Swale is not wicked, and so his approach is curious. So that's what I get from that.
Yeah, totally. I think you're totally, and I think, what does Mr. Swale want to talk about, even though
Death.
he's curious? Right.
Well,
yeah, exactly.
It's funny, if I may, I actually marked that passage to read. Yeah. So do you mind if I continue?
Yeah, no, let's go right into it. I mean, that's enough. Like, I just thought it was such a great example of atmosphere and mood, and like I thought really well done and not overwritten, and it sort of gathers to this kind of weirdness with like, what are those figures on the beach? Like, are they men? Are they trees? And like the boats are sort of tiny on the water. And yeah, it is this like, there is that grand sense that something wicked this way comes. But yeah, jump into what Mr. Swale says.
So he sits down next to her, and he holds her hand, and then he says, "I am afraid, my dearie, that I must have shocked you by all the wicked things I've been saying about the dead and such like for weeks past, but I didn't mean them, and I want you to remember that when I'm gone. We old folks that be daffled, and with 1 foot abaft the crook hole don't altogether like to think of it, and we don't want to feel scart of it. And that's why I've took to making light of it, so that I'd cheer up my own heart a bit. But Lord love ye, miss, I ain't afraid of dying, not a bit. Only I don't want to die if I can help it. My time must be nigh at hand now, for I be old, and 100 years is too much for any man to expect. And I'm so nigh it that the old man is already whetting his scythe. You see, I can't get out of the habit of capping about it all at once. The chaffs will wag as they used to. Someday soon the angel of death will sound his trumpet for me, but don't ye do and greet my dearie, for he saw that I was crying. If he should come this very night, I'd not refuse to answer his call, for life be, after all, only a waiting for something else than what we're doing, and death be all that we can rightly depend on. But I'm content, for it's coming to me, my dearie, and coming quick. It may be coming while we be looking and wondering. Maybe it's in that wind out over the sea that's bringing with it loss and wreck and sore distress and sad hearts. Look, look, he cried suddenly. There's something in that wind and in the host beyond that sounds and looks and tastes and smells like death. It's in the air. I feel it coming. I ord make me answer cheerful when the call comes. He is extending the foreboding, but then I think he's also, again, I think we're foiling Dracula here.
Right.
He's not denying death. He's accepting it. And in fact, death came for him in that, we don't know if he has a heart attack and dies of old age or if he's one of Dracula's victims, but he turns up dead the next day, I believe.
Yeah, real soon. And I mean, it's this book is great. It's really well written. I think you're right. We get this horrible foreboding, and then we get this very human character who admits his fear, but says that he hopes he can face it properly when it comes. Yeah. And of course, that's the thing that Dracula doesn't do. That's what makes him inhuman, is that he does not face death bravely. He steps aside about it. Right. And that's the whole unnatural situation that we're in that is causing the horror, that is causing the anxiety, that is about the sexual problems. This is a world that is going off the rails because of this violation that Dracula kind of, he embodies, inflicts upon it.
He's violating all sorts of things. He's violating all sorts of orders that, and there's a slight religious tinge to it, although it's subtle, right? We never talk about God, but there's the cross and the mention of the Lord. There's the sense of that, but then also, I think there's other foiling in the bravery and in the friendship, that Lucy and Jonathan's companions show, throughout the book too. And I think will continue to show in the second half.
We've sort of hit my question about larger anxiety leaving. I think you've got a reading and then a question about food, but we've also got to get to our mid-roll Patreon announcement.
All right. Well, why don't we do that? And then I would love to do both of my things, but I think I can do them both quickly. So do you want to do Patreon?
Yeah, everybody, we have a Patreon. We have had a Patreon for some time. We have a link in the show notes every time we publish. But also, if you just go to Patreon and you search for Upper Middlebrow, you will find us. And the show does have expenses that Jesse and I cover because we love doing this, and it's a way for us to hang out and talk about books and movies, and we hope that you guys enjoy it as well. But we do have some costs associated with production, and if you want to throw us a few dollars a month, we have some gifts for you in the order of some bookmarks that are done up in the Upper Middlebrow seasons. And we also have some opportunities for you guys to get some editorial time with me or Jesse or both of us, which would be really, really fun. We are both creatives and writers and editors, and we're really good at it, and we can help you streamline, edit, revise, ideate, anything that is creative that you are trying to crack, and we would really enjoy working with you. So if there are some ways that you could support us, we can help you with some lovely bookmarks and also with some editorial help.
And you can find us at patreon.com/upper_middle_brow. And on that note, on the topic of atmosphere, I'm going to save my question for the very end because it's kind of fun.
Okay.
I just want to read this passage. This was one of the first moments where I was reading this where I was like, oh, this is really good. And so we're in Jonathan Harker's travel log, and you and I were texting about this. It's almost like travel writing. He's like, I stayed at this really lovely inn, and the people here are interesting, and there's Serbs, and they talk this way, and Croats, and I had paprika chicken. It was good, but it made me thirsty. And so he's taking a carriage And he's supposed to meet Count Dracula, and we have this sense that the peasants who are taking him on this trip, they know who and what Dracula is, and they're kind of trying to save him, but they don't want to defy Dracula. So what they're doing is they're arriving at the rendezvous early, so Dracula won't be there, and then they could just take Harker onto the city and say, oh, sorry, you missed Dracula. Oh, well. I'll just start reading right here. There's no carriage here. This is the driver talking. The hare is not expected after all. He will now come to Bukovina and will return tomorrow or the next day. Better the next day. Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants and universal crossing of themselves, a caleche with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps and the rays on them that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight, as he turned to us. He said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend." The man stammered in reply. The English hare was in a hurry," to which the stranger replied, "That is why, I suppose, you wish him to go on to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth, as white as ivory. One of my companions whispered to another the line from Burger's Lenore, "Den die Toten reiten schnell," for the dead travel fast. The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passenger turned his face away at the same time, putting out his 2 fingers and crossing himself. "Give me the hare's luggage," said the driver, and with exceeding alacrity, my bags were handed out and put in the caleche. I mean, talk about hints and foreboding,
yep.
Right?
Totally, yeah, and just so brisk and efficient. There isn't anything extra in here, and it's really clear, and it's really good with its action and where the camera is pointing. Hilarious little moments with exceeding alacrity. My bags were handed out and put in the caleche.
Yeah.
Because they're fucking terrified.
Yeah. All right, give them the bag. Yeah. Although when you say there's nothing extra, I would argue that perhaps the inclusion of Burger's Lenore in the German and English from a peasant who just happens to be, I don't know that poem or that poet, but the fact that that's, that a peasant in a crossroads in the middle of the Carpathian Mountain chooses to quote a German poem is a bit much, but not in a way that bothers me at all. It's like totally, the cherry on top of that packet.
Right, you need it for the effect, and it's great. I mean, we first get the driver. And then we get this great moment of the horses screaming, and the caleche suddenly appears, and we look at the horses first, of course, because that's what you would see first. Then you get scary Gandalf.
Yeah, exactly. We later learn probably is Dracula.
Is Dracula, right? Yeah.
As a coachman. Yeah, and what's great too is that we, the reader, are a little bit ahead of Jonathan, right? It's like the Get Out phenomenon, we kind of know a little more. We know that probably these villagers were sort of trying to kind of avoid Dracula, maybe for their own benefit or maybe Jonathan's benefit, and that didn't work, that their plan was foiled, and now they're intimidated, and so I just think that's wonderful. But my final question before we go to trivia, so in Dracula's castle, Jonathan is served several meals that he describes as delicious, pretty good. I think there's another chicken paprika, and there's a stew at one point. But Jonathan deduces that there's no other living creature in the castle. There are no servants. And at one point, he even sees Count Dracula setting the table. So what is your mental model for how the food that Jonathan eats in the castle gets prepared. Like,
oh my god, I love this. This is what I, this is.
does he call into the
straight.
village for takeout? Does he like send a bat, to with a menu, to the nearby village, or
are we sadly spared the wonderful image of Dracula like going into the kitchen and like putting on an apron and being like,
pouring
yes,
some blood
no,
into a goblet and like inviting his brides over, right?
And then like taking like drinking.
Let's debone this chicken. I'm gonna make a delicious paprika. The young man was telling me about solicitors. It's really quite fascinating. And the brides are sort of like rolling their eyes and bored, and they're drinking blood out of golden goblets too, while they all hang out in the kitchen.
Like one of them tries like a piece of bread and like spits it out. It's just like, oh, this human food is disgusting. And like, that's what I want. Like, I want
Dracula
that scene.
slicing onions and whistling as he sort of like cleans the cutting board and slides the onions into the soup stock. And
what we need is we need Stanley Tucci to play Dracula, and we get the cooking scenes from Big Night I'm not remembering the name of the other actor. Gosh darn it. Who's
Tony
amazing.
Shalhoub.
That's right, Tony Shalhoub. Yes. We need the two of them to play a pair of culinary vampires.
Young friend, Mr. Harker, you may not go back to London yet, because if you did, you would miss my timpano. I'm going to make it on Sunday.
But the thing is like, you're not wrong, because there's so much food writing in the first 20 pages. Like, I think I joked with you. I was like, it's as if Lawrence Stern suddenly developed an appetite. And instead of just sort of like wandering around Europe talking about cultural things, he suddenly was like, no, like he was like AJ Lieblain and wanted to eat a bunch of oysters.
And it's not like Dracula can magically summon, because he has to, if he could magic food, he could magically set the table, but he's got to set the table himself. So he's got to cook the food somehow, or maybe he's got some terrified peasants, in the next village over, who bring it over every night at the right time, in exchange for Dracula like not eating their child.
I mean, we've pointed out a few of the moments of like the hand waving, and there is certainly some of that in here. That little preface is like the biggest one. Like, don't look. Don't look. like everything here is reliable because I said so. And and then there are a lot of details that we've already brought up about like, these things are here simply in service of the plot, and just stuff that could have been done, but if they were done, it would derail things. And so you get the wonderful
the men sitting up and protecting Lucy. There are a few things like that. Although, to be fair, like that could just be the Victorian. Like, it just doesn't occur to them that they could pass the night in Lucy's bedroom. That would be too unthinkable. Well, you ready for some trivia?
I am. Yeah. I'll go. Why not?
Okay.
I'll go. Okay, so as you might have read doing some research about Bram Stoker, side note, it is hilarious that he names his putative hero, Van Helsing, his own
Abraham.
name.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, wow, man, okay, awesome. I'm not putting anybody named Chris in anything I ever write.
Well, Joseph Haldeman's protagonist is Mandela, which is an anagram of his name.
Anagram.
It's not unheard of.
Totally. So Stoker worked as a theater critic in his early career and somehow becomes manager to one of the most famous English actors of his time, Sir Henry Irving. And by Stoker's own estimation, that's a key element here, how many letters addressed to Irving did Stoker have to write the reply to? Was it A, 50,000 letters, B, 500,000 letters, or C, 1 million and more letters?
I mean, I think the Stoker's estimation is the key here. And I really like, and a million and more feels like a Stoker-like phrase. So I'm going to go with C, a million and more.
Oh, damn it! I sold the red herring too well. It is 500,000. Which is an absurd number of letters to have claimed to have
I don't really believe
written.
that. I don't think a 500,000 letters. I mean, we do some quick math, but like that would be something like 1,000 a day for 3 years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it would be insane. It would be.
Yeah.
Presumably life crushing. But I thought that was a hilarious detail because it also turns out that Bram Stoker was not a great person and might have been prone to flights of ego.
Yeah, interesting career, right? He basically was an assistant and a theater director until his 50s or 60s, when Dracula hits. And that's too bad because I do enjoy his writing. And I was reading about some of his other books, and there are a couple that seem intriguing that I think I might check out at some point, just because I'm like, if they're even half as good as Dracula, that'd probably be a pretty good read.
I'm surprised how much I like this. I really like this. I'm really enjoying this. I'm really looking forward to reading it whenever I sit down to read it.
Yeah. So blood transfusions are an important part of the plot, as we've discussed. And as I mentioned before, blood transfusions did exist in this time period, but the fact that they seem to work each time is unlikely. It's possible that it could just be that the four men and Lucy were reasonable matches, but there was no knowledge of the ABO system in the 1890s, so blood transfusions often failed, and sometimes worked really well, and the doctors didn't know why in the 1890s. There were a number of experiments to try to make blood transfusions more successful. Which of these experiments was performed in the latter half of the 19th century to try to improve the success rate of blood transfusions? A, sheep's blood was used rather than human's blood under the theory that sheep, being good-natured, would have blood that was more likely to get along with the human blood.
Oh, no.
B, doctors substituted milk for blood on the theory that it had a similar viscosity to blood. Or C, blood from multiple donors would be blended and agitated in the hopes that whatever was causing the rejection would sort of average out to mostly compatible blood.
Oh, wow. Oh, gosh. These are all deeply plausible and deeply horrifying. I really hope it's not the sheep one. That feels a little earlier. Like that feels sort of in the biles and humors kind of era of medicine, though I might come to regret that. Gosh, the third one feels like they're sort of scrabbling at the edges of the correct science. But the milk one is just horrifying enough that I'm going to go with the milk.
Man, you're on a tear. You got it. And You're absolutely right that sheep's blood was used in early 1800s, and they sort of figured out that wouldn't work. Interestingly, one thing that they would sometimes do that did sometimes work was just saline, and because that would just increase the perfusion pressure, which often would be enough if a patient was really in severe exsanguination, that might be enough to get them through to where their body would start producing more blood cells. That did sometimes work. It's also apparently true that even sometimes the wrong blood would not. Often it would sort of fail to mix, or it would coagulate. But sometimes they could get away with that too. It's kind of fascinating, but blood transfusion before 1900 was a crapshoot. You just cross your finger.
Especially if they're injecting milk into you.
And actually, so interestingly enough, the milk did not always fail either. There are apparently instances.
Well, okay, I guess
because it's just adding volume, right? It's
totally.
Yeah.
Saline is much better, but
Yeah.
but I guess you're right. Like
If the milk doesn't have any
'cause-
bacteria in it, and it doesn't cause a clot,
what if it did have bacteria? Milk has so
Yeah.
much bacteria in it pre-pasteurization. Holy crap.
yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh,
Usually
horrifying.
if you were getting a blood transfusion in those days, you were pretty much on death's
Yeah.
door anyway. So,
Yeah. Good.
all right. Well,
Lord.
everybody, what's next is the second half of this novel. And we'll see if Van Helsing and Mina and Jonathan and their adventurous friends can foil the evil count's plots and his intrusions into the boudoirs of various young women throughout London town. Thanks for listening.
Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes nervously balance the books. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and Justin Reich, but you can find us on Patreon, where there are a number of tiers at which you could show your support.
And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbag.com or jessedukes.com, or you can enroll as a patron at the You Really, Really Like Us tier, which includes some one-on-one editorial time with one of us or the other or both. And you can now find us on Blue Sky. So please do that, and we'll see you next time for the conclusion of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
And close the windows.